everybody. I am acutely aware that I'm the only thing standing between you and dinner and refreshment. So, and it's a pub, which is even worse. And and also it's a privilege, but also weighty to follow such a wonderful presentation by my colleagues. I think if there was a theme for my presentation, I was loving earlier the way that we were celebrating small steps, because that would be more of a theme for my presentation myself as a faculty member, really at the beginning of the community engaged learning journey. And I also loved absolutely hearing about the power of stories as well in that presentation. So those are two themes coming up as well. And I chose this title, Learning Outcomes, Writing, Mercy Values. I'm talking about learning outcomes because I so wanted to do a community engaged learning project within a writing course that is in the general education curriculum. And that meant trying to envision the project within a course that already has extensive learning outcomes attached to it. So some of what I'm talking through is just trying to conceive from my position how I can fulfill all of these other objectives, but at the same time do what I want to do with my students. So just to give you a sense of this project in the class, so this was my fall 2023 honors section of research and writing, which is our required first-year composition course. I had 18 first-year students within this class. Our site was Elmwood Gardens. That is a long-term care facility in Erie, Pennsylvania. It is associated with the Presbyterian Church. And what happened within the course of the project is that each student wrote a memoir of their particular resident. So this is the general outline of the project itself, and I had a couple of reasons. I was really over-determined almost, the extent to which I wanted to implement a project like this and bring it to fruition and have it be successful. I mean, the first one, it almost goes without saying, is to incorporate the Mercyhurst core values. In particular, I just pulled one core value that I thought would be most helpful, most relevant in terms of bringing this project into the class for our students who have just come through the gates at Mercyhurst. So particularly, we're emphasizing our core values, ambassadors of the service. We are socially merciful. Mercy restores human dignity. And in that, I'm thinking about the dignity of all human stories, the dignity of all life stories and life narratives. Expands our social relations and empowers us to reach out in compassion to others. So that on the institutional, spiritual, mercy side is where I was coming from. There was also a more personal side to this as well, in that within the past year and a half before I conceived of this, my mother passed away. And myself, I have 4 siblings, and there's my father. And in terms of the eulogy and the obituary, they're all looking at me like, you're the writer, you're going to do the obituary, you're going to do the eulogy. Okay, fine. So, but I was basically in this position in the fog of grief, trying to track down certain pieces and certain facts about my mother's early life. So we knew that she had been a surgical nurse at Cleveland Clinic, and that she had gone out to Stanford and worked as a nurse, but there were pieces of her early life that we were missing before she got married. And I was trying to track down from her sister, now which hospital did she work at? And her sister says, oh, she was at research. She was at research. Well, no hospital in the world is just called research. You know what I mean? So you're like trying to track all of this down. And I remember thinking at the time, I wish that we had sat down with her while she was still alive and lucid and had just talked through her life with her and actually gotten it down on paper. So that was really, very much a compelling reason for me for doing this. And then, as I think we've mentioned a couple of times within the course of these talks, a desire on my part to see student social growth, You know, at some point in our history, we may have seen small talk, that ability to talk to a stranger, as somehow inconsequential, a kind of social etiquette. No, I now see it as an incredibly valuable skill for students to find a way to feel comfortable with somebody, say, from definitely a different generation, potentially a different walk of life. So that was all a big impetus for this project as well. And as I was conceiving of the project, I had lots and lots of wonderful support at Mercier. So our academic community engagement office, we started off, so this was spring in 2022, and myself as director of the Center for Teaching Excellence, I was facilitating these workshops. So I thought, oh, well, I'll just be in the workshop. You know, I'm going to be there anyway. So I was in the community engaged learning workshops, so they set up 3 of those, and those were great. And Maria, you talked at one of those about your PRISM project, and your student who was involved in the project also spoke. That was very impactful, very moving. That semester, this all concluded with a community partner meet and greet. So we had 24 community partners set up at tables, and it was almost a kind of speed dating format. So you could go talk to all, and of course I was making the beelines to anyone with older residents, you know, and I was also very attracted to sites under the auspices of healthcare as well. One of my research areas is medicine and literature, or more broadly, the medical humanities, so I was definitely attracted to people within that realm as well. So that was our community partner meet and greet, and then in fall 2023, when I was with the students, I had 2 all-class visits, bookended the project. And then meanwhile, we had the community engaged learning program. That office was responsible for individually transporting the students to meet with their residents for the 2 meetings between those bookended all-class meetings. And then just, you know, to give a kind of shout out to 2 people, and I know Alice has been at the roundtable before, but Bethany Woods, our academic community engagement officer. We have Dr. Alice Edwards, she's our faculty liaison for community engagement. And then I didn't have a single photo, but this was Amy Sebald, the director of lifestyle engagement at Elmwood Gardens at the facility. And she was just so incredibly supportive and excited about the project. She was just absolutely wonderful. So again, like, one of the challenges I found was integrating this project with the fairly extensive list of learning outcomes that the English department has already created for our first year writing program for our composition courses. So, you know, here's a whole bunch of them, you know, identifying key elements of successful writing, focus and voice. I mean, I don't need to read all of these out. Organizing writing into a logical progression of ideas. You know, one that I will definitely note here is much of this is focused very much on argument. So assessing the persuasiveness of another writer's argument, composing arguments using relevant outside sources for evidence or context. Now, someone's life story, that's not argument, that's a narrative. So I felt that that was part of my challenge of conceptualizing how the project can fit within the class. Revising essays significantly based on feedback. Well, that wasn't difficult at all, because we did workshop and take each individual resident memoir through several drafts, you know, so that was no problem. It was more the argument element of it. So what I ended up doing was, okay, I chose life writing as the theme for the course. Life writing can include biography, it can include autobiography. And then I was taking a step further and thinking, I want each of these primary writings that we're working with, where students are writing much more traditional essays about, I want each of them to be personal narrative. They're grounded in personal narrative, but they nonetheless have a larger argument, either explicitly or implicitly made within them. So along those lines, it was important for us, if anybody have Janine Capo-Crusette, for example, her personal experience within her essay, that is all she's making a larger point about her identity and the immigrant experience. Edward Said, he has a wonderful photographic essay about his identity as a Palestinian in exile. John Edgar Wideman from Pittsburgh, his writing is very much based on his interviews with his brother who was incarcerated, and he's just an absolutely wonderful writer. So that was how I was working with personal narratives, yet we have a larger argument, and we were able to investigate certain themes within these writings, and the idea was that these would pay off when the students would be working through these themes in a much more practical way in terms of working with their resident and writing the memoir. So, for example, some of the themes that came up in these writings were investigating the nature of memory, the use of visual images within a photographic essay. Again, that was Edward Said. And as well, the relationship of the interviewer to the biographical subject. So that's something that John Edgar Wideman was very reflective about in terms of his interviews and writing about the story of his brother and why his brother ended up in prison. And it was always a question for Edgar Wideman, like, as a writer, he wants to hear a certain kind of story from his brother, and resisting that inclination to make his brother's story his story. And I truly did find that this was one of the challenges, or something that we had to work through in the class. The resident has a certain kind of story, the student's hoping for certain kinds of stories, and I think I'm saying, you know, writing in relation, or we might say writing in mercy, is that space between, right? That space of negotiation. So we basically had 6 stages of this project. So initially, the students were coming in, and this was all class, and they were each individually completing the interview form, and this is a really extensive form with their individual resident. And this form was created myself and Amy in collaboration. So this form is going to go in basically the residence file. And it's something that the nursing staff might be able to look at and digest information, important aspects about the patient or the resident's life, and they can digest it very quickly. So again, we came up with that initial form in collaboration, me and Amy. And also a portion of the form, students and I added questions to it as well that we thought would be really helpful for the actual narrative. Then the students would come back individually and they would have a more in-depth interview with the resident based on what they were able to garner from that initial interview form. Go back, research the resident's life and draft, and it was important for me to have that research component in there. The class is in fact called Research and Writing. Then they're coming back with their rough draft of the resident's life, reading or talking through that rough draft with the resident and getting feedback from the residents. Because sometimes the resident wants something changed, or the student didn't quite get it right. Or what's oftentimes the case, the resident, what's written jogs something else for them. So then they start talking and we have the student writing this all down. This moment of collaboration, though, can be... So one thing that I mentioned is that I actually did the project myself before I had my students do it. So, you know, I had this wonderful initial resident, and she was in a romantic relationship with one of the other residents. So, okay, great. So I'm taking down all this stuff about their relationship and how great he is and all of this. So then I come back, you know, with my rough draft, and she's like, okay, you need to cut all that. So I had broken up. I mean? I was just like, you're kidding me. So she let me keep it in there where he was a friend, you know. So that's part of the collaboration process. And then finally, you know, presentation of a print copy to the resident. And here's just an example of what one of these print copies might look like. And then the students in the last week of class, they would all be coming together to give us a presentation that reflected on the process in their particular resident's life. So, and you know, I did, in terms of thinking about audience, in terms of thinking about service, so this interview form, I mean, it really was, I'm seeing it as a very important component of this, because one of the things that Amy told me is that her staff and the nurses, they would love to know all of this fine-grained detail about their residents. They don't have time to sit down and go through a 7-page form with them and take down their responses. But my students did. So again, that form, and that's all going back to Amy and back to the facility, I saw that as a really important component of the class. And then all the additional stages, and then the life story, the print copy for the resident, it was handed to them as a bound copy, and if they wanted it electronically as well, we would send it to them. It was completely up to them. You know, some people have asked me, like, oh, well, like, what on earth would they be researching? So that Edward Said essay was really helpful, the idea of a photo essay. I mean, and really one of the primary things that students were researching were trying to find interesting, enlivening visual images. And this is really primarily online internet research. So they're looking for images of people, looking for images of places, trying to get it, if not in the exact right year, at least a historical photograph within the right decade. So sometimes those photographs would be resident-owned, which was great. More oftentimes, students were seeking them on the internet. They were also looking for things that my students did not understand. These would be, they needed to research for themselves as a writer, an unfamiliar practice or concept. So for example, we had one gentleman, a resident, who ended up building up a very successful business that was milk routes or milk runs. My student had no idea what a milk run was. And I'm like, well, it's like they deliver milk to your door. And they're like Amazon would deliver it? Well, no, not exactly like that. You know what I mean? So you've got to, and they're like, oh, you know, like this is actual meaningful research for them, trying to understand what the resident is talking about. Something else that was really unfamiliar with my resident that I interviewed was a form of dancing that she did called ballet tap on toe. So this was, have you heard of this? I had never heard of this. It's a cross between ballet and tap dancing. And I don't think anybody does it anymore, but it was obviously popular in Erie up well into the 50s. It was incorporated in vaudeville shows. So we had to do some research to just figure out what, you know, they are on point with taps at the end of the ballet shoes. So she was quite proud of how she mastered this. And just in terms of where the kinds of sources that they're looking for, I mean, obviously like a Google image search and refining their keywords. Ancestry.com, I mean, Maria was talking about violations. I mean, I'm sure I'm in violation of copyright and everything. But I just went and I got an Ancestry account for myself and shared the password with my class. And so we found that very helpful. I mean, particularly in terms of finding census records. There's a lot on there. Ancestry.com can also be very helpful for pulling up yearbook photos as well. And some residents are absolutely thrilled. They haven't seen their yearbook photo for 50 years, and here we're presenting it to them, you know, in the final memoir. Surprisingly, we found vintage postcard sites, you know, and if you can get that image of the postcard, you can copy it off the internet and then go put it in the resident memoir. And then sometimes, to some extent, social media. So this right here is just an image of a restaurant that was in Erie, kind of a high-scale Italian restaurant that one of the residents, she had worked there when she was young, you know, and there was actually a vintage postcard out there on the internet of this particular restaurant. So those were the kinds of images that they were looking for. And then just to mention too, just as we're moving more towards the conclusion here, some of the challenges that we did encounter over the process. We were not expecting, like I was surprised when you mentioned COVID today. We, past fall, weren't really thinking about COVID moving into this. A resident did come back from the hospital. It spread to 27 of the residents who were in the facility, 10 of the staff and nurses. So that was a real nail biter to have be shut out from that facility and having an important component of this class being this project. We did it, you know, we pulled it out. So I'm very thankful for that. That was definitely our number one challenge. How to organize this draft. You know, you're getting all this stuff, you know, the form and then the interviews and all this stuff is in the collaboration coming in, you know, so just trying to have a vision, like what is going to make the most sense here. Student schedules, as you can imagine, particularly we have a great dance program, but our dancers, like their afternoons are booked, and of course student athletes within certain programs. That was also difficult because, I mean, they can only go when our van drivers can go. These students do not have cars, so transport was a really important piece of this. In terms of challenges with some of the residents, I mean, probably the number one issue is memory issues. You know, like, for example, I had one student say, you know, I did some research and the names that she gave me for her siblings are actually the exact names of her children. I'm like, well, I think we might have something a little confusing. So sometimes the research, there's an element of nailing down some facts as part of the research. I think that's just fine. Also, you know, somewhat surprisingly, the resident reluctance to address some issues. So for example, the students and I created what we thought were amazing life reflection questions for the residents. Like, you know, what kind of advice you give to your younger self, or what did you find most helpful in terms of coping with the most difficult aspects of your life, or difficult stages in your life? Some residents thought these questions were great and would have so much to say. Others were just, oh, I don't know, you know, like very dismissive. Oh, you don't like my question, you know? So again, that kind of reluctance on that point. And, you know, closely related to that too would be, and this was in terms of getting the residents, this is mostly on Amy's part, getting them to agree to do the project, was resident anxiety about privacy. Like, they're telling all of these details of their life to this student, like, where is this going, you know? So, and in fact, that then became an issue for me as the instructor in the course. So our public relations director really liked this story of us gathering resident stories. So she wanted to have a big story about it up on the Mercyhurst website. And I said, we can do the story, but we cannot use any resident names. And she was disappointed that she had to write the story without names. But I mean, I just had to be clear on that. She wanted to bring in a film crew for a presentation of the final drafts. Well, no, the healthcare network that owns this facility will not allow cameras in there. So, you know, privacy was definitely an issue. Just some of the student responses to the project, you know, I've just really tried to pull out a couple key themes. You know, I guess this is really positive. This wasn't just for a grade. I mean, I think that's positive. something that I saw as a kind of unexpected benefit, many of our students are coming to us from Ohio or maybe Southern New York. They're not from Erie. They don't feel connected to this small city. But then they say, oh my gosh, I learned so much about Erie in terms of doing this historical research. So I thought that was really helpful and valuable. Some of them talking about the research being fun, certainly myself loving to work in archives, like that sense of the hit when you really find something, if they feel like they're getting a dopamine hit from finding something that they've been searching for, I'm so thrilled that it's happened doing this, maybe not just another TikTok video or whatever, so, other students saying something like, I'm not really one to talk to strangers, and this did force me out of theme as well, out of my comfort zone. And then also just a sense of inspiration, like saying, well, I was really inspired. Some were really taken aback, but just how much grief and loss there was in many of these residents' life. Maybe you would expect that their spouse would have died, but some of them, lost children. And my students seeking to understand, how someone could cope and live and move on and heal from some of the experiences of the residents. And then just, looking forward, there are some things I definitely want to keep doing moving forward. I think it's absolutely crucial, emphasizing a positive and respectful relationship on the part of the student with both the resident and our site partner, Elmwood Gardens staff. Students really need to understand that Amy's staff who works with her, they're taking time out of their busy day to bring these students back to rooms. And, they are helping us, and I definitely want us to always be incredibly respectful and really grateful for the ways that they're facilitating our project. I do think I would absolutely do again, or any kind of new project, do the project myself before the semester begins. There were certain aspects of it that I was able to troubleshoot and modify just because I'd gone through all the steps. And then it was also crucial, and I will do this again, to start the project very early in the semester. So I had Amy and Bethany into my classroom in the second week of class, even though the final life narrative wasn't due until the very end of class. And especially with the COVID shutdown for weeks, I'm just so glad I decided to set it up that way. I think I basically like the stages, including the student presentations at the end. I felt like they had this almost sense of ownership over their resident. Like, look how interesting my resident's life is, at the same time, though, there are certain things that I would change in terms of the next iteration. So, and I think I would do this very much from the beginning. So, even from the beginning, more emphasis on the writing in relationship, or I might even say writing in mercy. Less in terms of an emphasis on what the final project is going to look like, or to have a predetermined assumption about what that final life narrative is going to look like. So just a quick example, one resident that a student worked with, this resident never got married or had children, and never worked after she was 17. She had done a little bit of babysitting early on. So after that, she basically lived at home with her mom and her dad and her sister. After her parents passed away, her sister was still there in the house. After her sister passed, she was in Elmwood Garden. So really what you're finding is this kind of challenge of writing a life story. You come to realize how our archetypal master narratives are marriage and children or job, career, vocation. Like, what if the story has neither of those, And I think the resident ended up being happy with the final project. I was encouraging the student, let's talk about early memories, let's talk about likes and dislikes, let's go deep on any hobbies that she's had in her life. So, again, like just really privileging, foregrounding the relationship, not at least the vision I had in the beginning, that I was thinking these final life narratives would look more similar to each other than they really did. Also, learn about the resident interview preferences early. So it was great for us to be all communal at that first meeting, you know, and we had the staff bringing us cookies and tea, and that was all very lovely. But some of the residents were just completely overwhelmed by being in that enormous cavernous room, all that ambient noise. It was too much. We should have figured out at the very beginning, we could have pulled some of those students and the residents to go back to rooms or more quiet spaces. And that was something that neither Amy nor I had foreseen, because she herself has never done this project. And then just finally, starting, if you have resident photos, start with them. Because particularly if a particular resident has memory issues, there is something about photos, and I'm sure music would be the exact way. It is a direct line to a deep wellspring of memory and emotion. We should have started with those, not incorporated them later in the project. Okay, so thank you guys so much for listening. Yes.
I was going to say, Susan and I do a similar interview process. It's a research project for our developmental psych students.
Okay.
So, but we allow them to interview someone in the context of adult development between the ages of 60 and 75.
So you're getting institutional research permission for that, and
We are just calling it a case study research project. We aren't getting any funding. We do the best that we can, like informed consent, making things anonymous. At one point, I had PowerPoint presentations where they could incorporate pictures if that person okayed it.
right.
But we didn't go to any agencies or anything like that. We allowed them to seek the person out themselves. And we did say with recording purposes, at least I do, I think Susan does too, that if you do record the person, it's usually their family member. So I said you do have to gain consent with that.
Right.
And what we do that helps, and it may help you if you look into adult development, because the outliers that you're mentioning, like disease, or maybe even the person who didn't get married, didn't have children, and didn't have all these other experiences, if you look at, you look at the developmental Eric Erickson.
Right.
Look into his theories of like, you do immortality versus extinction. You can context it around the legacy pieces. And again, I would not disregard the outliers that you're getting these. I would embrace them in some way, that the student could possibly dive deeper, maybe grab some research on, maybe it's something of a feeling like they don't have something to offer. The questions matter, of course, and it's okay to be qualitative. In fact, Susan and I prefer qualitative in certain interview processes, but to grab like an outline, Eric Erickson can be a great start.
Oh, thank you very much for that.
Really a great start. And I think you're doing wonderful work, and I know it must be really, really hard going into the facilities and getting all of those permissions, and the wide room, that does matter. I had students, they said, and they interviewed their grandparents, didn't know all of these things that had happened in their life. And there's certain life questions you can ask that are gentle enough that should promote a discussion, and that you don't have to get too deep into certain things. You could. I mean, it depends.
It's whatever they're willing to share,
right?
And
it could go on for hours.
It's funny. I had one student raise his hand and say, "My dad says, why aren't you having us do this with family members instead of some stranger?" I'm like, well, this is community engaged learning. But here's the good news. You don't have the tools to do this for any family member that you choose.
Right. Yeah, and it's a beautiful thing. length of time. I had students complain, well, she talked for like 5 hours. I'm like, well, there's a way that you can reduce that, and we actually
And
did.
yet, at the same time, there are also residents where my students
Right.
needed techniques to draw them out.
Right.
They were very succinct, very brief. You need to have
That's
a whole
good.
litany of follow-up questions and think on your feet.
That's good.
I apologize if you said this already, but what are the main applications of this? Because I could foresee, for example, using this for their eulogies or for some notice of passing, or just to give back to their families. They probably don't know all of these details about their lives. Maybe for them to remember if they're losing their memories, for them to read it every now and then. What are some uses that you envision?
You know, some of the uses I know, just from what the residents have said or what Amy has told me, is she said one of the really great outcomes of this is that the resident will have it in their room, you know? And when they have visitors, it just gives them something to talk about, and it's a way to bring the resident and others into the past, and oftentimes talk about family history or their own collective and shared path. So I think even strengthening those kinds of family relations, I am certainly in terms of thinking of legacy, that this would be a valuable resource, you know? I mean, I certainly don't frame it that way to the residents, like, we're getting everything down before you're gone, you know? We're trying to keep everything really upbeat. Yeah, so, and you know, but again, like residents were like, oh, so this is all going on the internet? And we're like, no, it's not. You know, I got consent to have that in bound copy. But you hand the bound copy to the resident, and then they're in control of who reads it. So, you know, interestingly, some of the nursing staff would take home the bound copies and read them at home, which I thought was really wonderful. They're doing that on their own time, you know? And then that gives them conversational talking points with their patients, or something beyond their medical chart.
I wanted to share too that one of our nursing instructors actually did a similar research, and actually did this with the Sisters of Mercy.
Oh,
And
that's
what,
great.
you know, brought them to their calling. So because the psychological aspects of nursing, they wanted to look at it developmentally, and I think it was Dr. Cindy Leffold that did it.
Yeah,
And
that sounds
she interviewed,
wonderful.
I think it was like 10 of the sisters, and did this whole, I mean, she did it for a couple of years too, for her LPN students. So then that helped the LPN students really understand, you know, what are people's desires and motivation, and sometimes things aren't all scientific.
Right,
A
right.
spiritual connection.
And you know, just thinking about it from a totally different context, I know in terms of some of the research that I did on projects like this, it seems to be primarily England, you know, the NHS funded projects where they will pay someone to come down and take, you know, get the life narrative of a patient or a resident. But I couldn't find anything comparable for that in the United States, particularly a healthcare setting, which I thought was interesting. Like, why are they so on it in England, you know?
That's because we have a notoriously ageist society compared to England.
So,
Unfortunately, and so part of the thing that I really like about your class, and we've done similar things in gerontology in our arena, is this removal of the age segregation that happens, especially for college students, where, and I mean, even our elementary schools are filled with maybe the oldest person they see is a teacher who's retiring before they get to the oldest old categories. So
Right.
until, or unless it's our grandparents, often, younger adults aren't seeing this, and it's not something brought into their mindset. So we were even trying to build a gerontology major, and the students were like, why? Why would we study old people, right? So it is this, yeah,
oh
it's
my
this
gosh,
true.
the need for
Exactly.
I mean,
Well, and that's, so I'm sure if you all talk to your nursing departments, they will also say none of the nurses want to go into gerontology. They want to go into babies and obstetrics, right? So it's this Yeah, and the wisdom is going to be lost because unless we do archives like what's happening here, right? It's not on TikTok, it's not on social
Right.
media, and so that's part of the reason you're seeing it is. This is my favorite area in sociology. I should have led with that. My mom worked in a nursing home my entire life, so I've spent my life hanging out in nursing homes. So this is the thing: is that we have this immense and fundamentally heart-wrenching gap between the youngest and the oldest in our society. So.
And you know, one thing that's a really wonderful outgrowth of this is that Amy has told me, so we have this Beyond the Gates as a required service learning year after they say, oh, I want to go back to Elmwood Gardens, because they want to see their person, you know, so which is wonderful.
Yeah.
Do you find that the nature of how the students write and the sort of questions that they ask during a process of writing completely shifts when they're writing in relationship with another person? Like the purposeful act clarifies a lot of the
Right.
kind of smaller questions? Or is it the same? It's just a
You
different-
mean like that this is not a thesis-driven argument?
Or like, why do I have to organize paragraphs or have topic sentences, or, you know, like, what's...
I think that a project like this helps you realize, well, we want our reader to have a positive experience, for there to be flow, for there to be meaningful reasons that this is all together within a particular paragraph, that we have accurate and detailed captions on each photograph. You know, like, hopefully they are imagining both the resident and or the resident's family or the nursing staff or whoever it is as real readers, you know, with this in front of their face. And that was a big motivation for me as well, you know. And I really did love that part of it too, like when they're bringing the rough draft to the resident and kind of collaborating in that way on what the final draft is going to look like. You know, the students may do a lot of workshopping, either in a composition class or a creative writing class, but this felt more truly collaborative to me than even what happens in many of those academic settings. And a lot of times the students, they really want to please their resident too, you know, they're really motivated.
I think this is great because they come about training without an audience in their writing. They're writing audience-less pieces, and
Right.
this is a great way to help them to transition to the real world of writing.
And I was hoping that them see, you know, that the audience for the form and the way that you're writing and like the narrative bits in the form, that's a very different audience than the audience for the life story project. And hoping that kind of different choices that they make in each of those scenarios would be clear when they're thinking about two very different audiences. Okay, everybody, any